Okay, so after our last class, and we were going over the skull and everybody was having such a difficult time identifying the different bones and the structures, especially because the numbers on the models that we have, they're medical models, which means that they have all of the numbers for all of the structures that a medical professional, so like a doctor, would need to know. Since our purposes are that you just need to know some of the main ones, some of the key ones, I wanted to get some disarticulated skulls, and that's what you're seeing here. This is the one that we have in our laboratory classroom. These are some disarticulated skulls that I purchased and plan on returning after I have gone through. I went through and looked at each of them, decided which ones I like best. I did ask for the college to purchase them, so hopefully those will be in our class. But we shall see. So I wanted to go through and use these models to show you the different things. If you guys end up getting a model, just for reference, this one I don't think is super great. It's hard to put together. It feels good, but it's not super great. This is the medical model from our classroom. This little mini guy is great. I'm hoping to get some for the classroom. And then these two are basically the same thing from two different companies. They actually use different things to put them together. So this one over here uses all plastic pins to be put together and a couple of magnets, not many. This one over here uses metal pins and lots of magnets. Now, this one holds together better. It's a great model. I'm going to use it today. This one falls apart terribly. But I think this is the one that we're going to go with for our classroom because it's much easier to put together. The metal pins don't give any give. And so this one's really, really hard to put together and take apart. This one's much easier, even though it kind of falls apart on its own. So I'm going to carefully slide this guy out of the way for now, and kind of slide each of these out of the way. And I'm going to start with this little guy. So this one's nice. Its mandible moves. I'm going to go through each of the structures that you need to know in our bone lab. I'm going to show you on this little guy, on our model here, and then on the model that is like the one that we'll see in the classroom as well, so that you can see all the different structures. And this way I can also go through and say the names of them as well. So, all right, so we're going to start with the exercise 1, which are the cranial bones. So it starts with the cranial sutures. And so I have my pointer here. The cranial sutures are just all of these individual lines here. So you just have to be able to identify on the exam or on quizzes that if there's a label that's pointing toward any one of these lines are the sutures, which are a joint between the two skull pieces. So we have various sutures all in the cranial region. So any of these sutures are the cranial sutures. Generally, you'll be pointing to any of the ones up here. So you don't have to know the individual names of the sutures, just know them generally as the cranial sutures. The first actual bone is the frontal bone. So on our model that we have in the classroom, this is the frontal bone, the forehead bone. You can see the number 1 here. Perhaps you can see that. And it is the number 1 on the key. So I also have the answer key that goes along with this model in the hopes to help with the numbers for that as well. So the frontal bone is the forehead bone. Again, what I really like about the colored ones, which is why I wanted to get them, is you can see how it kind of curves under and makes part of the orbit as well. So this green bone here is our frontal bone. You can see how it comes to the side. So kind of the side, the temples is what we think of, or we call over here the temple. This is part of our orbit, so our eyebrow region, and then over here on the other temple, and it just starts the bridge of the nose here. You can see it on this model as well. Up here, it's the blue one, right? So you can see how it goes under. And I think what's important to see here is that how much it does make up the orbit of the eye. Okay. Great, so that's the frontal bone. The second one you need to know are the parietal bones. So I'll indicate on this one because they're the same color. The parietal bones are these two bones on the upper part of the skull, so superior portion of the skull. On this model, they are these pink and purple bones, parietal bones here. And then you can see them on our skull in the classroom, the actual skull or bone shapes or colored skull as these two bones here, the parietal bones. Next one are the temporal bones. Oh, and the parietal bones are number 2 on the key. Our temporal bones are number 4, and the temporal bones are right here on the side of the head. So the temporal bones are right on the side of the head. And you can see those better in our colored models, right? So the temporal bone is this bright kind of yellow-orange one on the right side of the skull, okay? And then on the left side of the skull, okay? So our temporal bones here, and on the little guy, a yellow temporal bone here. And this one's a mix of kind of this teal and the yellow here. Okay, great. So with the temporal bones, you need to know the external acoustic meatus. And so this is basically our ear canal. This is how when we hear, so externally here, we would have our actual ear, and then we would have the tunnel that goes to our ear into where we're going to actually connect up with our brain. We're going to carry those signals into the brain. And so this is our ear canal, which is also called the external acoustic, meaning sounds, meatus. And meatus is a large hole here. So external acoustic meatus. And we have that on both sides. External acoustic meatus. Again, on the one in the lab, because you need to be able to identify it on these. External acoustic meatus and external acoustic meatus. Okay. All right, the mastoid process. So when we're looking at the temporal bone, the mastoid process is going to be this large bony structure back here. And actually we can feel it back behind our ear. It's this giant kind of bump in the back. So this is the mastoid process. Again, we have one on either side. But you can see, again, we're looking at the temporal bone here, and then here's the mastoid process here. So external acoustic meatus, mastoid process. The last thing, or not the last thing, but the mandibular fossa. Yes, the last thing you need to know is the mandibular fossa on the temporal bone. So the mandibular fossa is the part where our mandible is going to meet with our temporal bone. And that's actually, the fossa is the indent where that's going to meet. So this indent, remember a fossa is an indented ridge. So a fossa is going to be where this bone, the mandible, is going to go inside. And you can see that also in this one from the classroom. So if I take the mandible and move it to the side, you can see the indent here, right here. So that's our mandibular fossa. You can see that on both sides. You can see I'm going to put the mandible right in that spot, and that's where we're going to have movement in that fossa. Great. The next one is the occipital bone. So the occipital bone is this, in this model, this giant purple one. So this is the back of the skull, right? So posterior. So this is our front, and this is the back. And the occipital bone is all the way in the back here, the purple. We can also see that here, in the back here. So you can kind of see it's cut because of the way that these models are cut open, so you can see the inside. But it starts at this suture here and then is going to go all the way down here. Good. On the occipital bone, you need to know the foramen magnum. This is one that is not labeled on the actual answer key in the classroom. That's because it's this gigantic hole here, so we can't put a number on this hole, but or there should be just pointing to it. But the foramen magnum is this huge hole in the purple on this model, occipital bone here. So you can see the occipital bone goes all the way up to here. And then this large hole is where our spinal cord is going to come out of. So the brain will be in here, and then our spinal cord will come down. So you can see the orientation here. So of course, then you can easily find that here as well. You can see the large hole is our foramen magnum. So foramen magnum here. Okay. What you also need to know are the occipital condyles. So the occipital condyles are actually going to be these bumps here on either side of the foramen magnum. So this is an occipital condyle, this is an occipital condyle, and you can see them in this model as well. So an occipital condyle. And that's where our first vertebrae are going to sit, as on these bumps. That's the importance of those. So the first vertebrae are there protecting the spinal cord that's going to come out. All right, so next is the sphenoid bone. And these models are my favorite just because of finding the sphenoid bone. So what I want to do is show this small model. So we have our frontal, our parietal bones, our occipital bone with the foramen magnum and our occipital condyles. When we're looking at the underside of the skull is where we can see the sphenoid the most without taking it apart. So the sphenoid in this model is this blue. Okay, so this blue one underneath here. And I'm going to take this apart more so that you can see it, but it's really the very center of our whole skull. So you can see the blue there. In this model, it's the darker orange. So you can see this darker orange here. This is our sphenoid bone. So again, the middle. And so what I'm going to do is take these models apart. First, I want to show it to you on this one. So you can see the sphenoid bone. It is, I like to call it bat-shaped or butterfly-shaped. Bat-shaped is because it goes with a lot of the nomenclature that you don't need to know about different parts of it. But so it's got wings here. So there are wings over here and wings over here, and it goes toward the middle here. So you should be able to identify the sphenoid bone that's in here. Now, the easiest way, or another way to identify it, let's see if I can take this apart here. We're going to take off the frontal bone. All right, we're just going to take the face apart. All right, so if we take that apart, I know maybe you're not knowing where our orientation is, but this would be the front here where the face used to be. And then this is our purple, remember, occipital bone. So if we're looking on the inside of the skull, here is where we find the sphenoid, is right here. Okay, so the inside of the skull, the very bottom part. So if we're looking at it this way, right, we would have our parietal bones on top here, and then the face is going to be here. And so our brain is going to be sitting right in here and sitting right on top of that sphenoid bone that's right in the center of the skull. And that's why it actually has so many holes in it. It's because that's where a lot of our cranial nerves are going to go. So that they go to things like our hearing, our smelling, our vision. All of those things are going to be coming out of, or many of them are coming out of the sphenoid bone. Okay. So some of the things that you need to know on the sphenoid bone are the sella turcica. So the sella turcica is this indented area right here. Sella meaning seat and turcica, Turkish. So the Turkish seat looks like a little seat here if you were riding this little bat coming this way. So sella turcica. And then you need to know the optic foramen. So if we're looking at the front of the sphenoid, now remember the face is going to be here. But if we're looking at the front of the sphenoid bone itself, we'll get rid of the vomer. You can actually see the optic foramen are going to be right in here. So that's an optic foramen and that's an optic foramen. Okay, so on this one, our sphenoid, right, is this blue color. Let's get reoriented. We're looking at the bottom of the skull now. Our sphenoid is this blue color. So you can see that the sphenoid, which is why it's labeled on all of your images that you need to label, it comes all the way up here as well. So you can see the sphenoid comes here, it's here, comes again all the way over to the other side. But then also, if you look inside, the sphenoid is also part of our orbit, which is where our eyeball will be. So you can see the sphenoid is the back part of the orbit, in the back part here. So the optic foramen are actually going to be right back there, okay? So if you're indicating on this type of image, right, on this one, you can see the foramen really nicely. It's this giant hole, not this giant hole down here that's kind of an angle, but the one that's more of a hole in there. Hopefully you can see that, the optic foramen. So I want to show you the sphenoid again in this view. So when we're looking at the skull in this view, you can see right here, this is our sphenoid, right? Just like, let's see if I can take this apart without losing the face here. Here we go. So if we look at these two models, you can see the sphenoid is here, and you can see the sphenoid is here, right? So if you're indicating it on a tan model, a bone-colored model, you can now see where that sphenoid is. You can see the sella turcica, and then you can see the optic foramen as well. Sella turcica and the optic foramen. Okay. All right, so next we have the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone is going to be right in front of, right, because this is anterior, okay, right in front of or anterior to the sphenoid bone. So this is our ethmoid bone if we're looking at it from the interior part of the skull. So similarly, if we're looking at the interior part of the skull, this is the ethmoid. And what you're not seeing here compared to here is that we don't have our frontal bone on this one. So let's see if I can match that up. There we go. Kind of. So you can see the frontal bone kind of hides the ethmoid a little bit. That's why it's smaller on this model, the ethmoid, because the frontal bone is kind of in the way, blocking it a little bit. So you can see the ethmoid is right here. It's kind of very bumpy. So that is our ethmoid. You need to know, the one thing you need to know on the ethmoid is the cribriform plate. The cribriform plate is really what you see of the ethmoid when you're looking at this part of the skull. So this is the cribriform plate, and you can tell it has all these little tiny dots on it. They're little teeny tiny holes. And that's because what is just anterior and inferior is where we smell, right? So our olfactory nerves, our smelling sense, all of those nerves are going to come up and go through the ethmoid to the brain. That's our cribriform plate of our ethmoid. Now, you do need to label it on other images, meaning not just looking down on the inside of the skull. And you can do that because if we look at the colored one, recall that the ethmoid is a yellow color in here. If we look at where it comes out, you can see this is the side of the ethmoid here, and you can see the other side of the ethmoid here. Okay, so that's why we can label the ethmoid in many places. So if we're looking at the side image, you can see the ethmoid here. If we're looking inside of the skull, you can see the ethmoid under here. And even if we're looking in the inside, in the nose, this is the bottom of the ethmoid. Remember, it's yellow. So this is the bottom of the ethmoid in here. Okay. I want to see if I can put this one back together a little bit here so you can see the ethmoid here. All right, so this ends up being a little difficult. We will see if I can do it in a relatively quick way. Well, it doesn't look like that's going to happen because our maxilla broke in half. And our palatine bone. But we're going to need this back together anyway because this model has things that the other model does not have. All right, so if I can try to get this put together. Okay. All right, so what I wanted to show you, and maybe I will pause the video and take the time to put this together, is showing you the ethmoid on this one. So actually, I think I will just take a moment and put this guy back together. And I'll just have to cut this part out. All right, let's go back to the drawing board here. Okay. All right, so hopefully through the magic of editing, you haven't seen all of me trying to put that back together. So what I wanted to show you was I put this skull mostly back together. I'm going to take the face off really quick here. So we're going to talk about the facial bones, but not for a moment here. So I wanted to get us reoriented. So we have our frontal bone, parietal bones, occipital bone, temporal bone, and then if we look underneath, right, so this is the front, this is the back, right, so we have our sphenoid bone here, right, so our sphenoid is the dark orange, and what I wanted to show you is that the sphenoid bone is just posterior to our ethmoid bone. So the ethmoid is this giant white one here, so you can really see the ethmoid bone here, anterior to the sphenoid, and you can see how it is a part of the orbit. So the orbit, the eye would be right here, and this is part of the orbit. You can see again here, if we take it apart, you can see how this part is the part of the orbit. Okay. All right, so moving on from the ethmoid bone, we are going to talk about the facial bones. So maybe I will take this other one that is also falling apart. These are very hard to keep together, so we'll kind of hold it together. So our maxilla, okay, our maxilla, it's actually two bones. Are these yellow bones here. It's actually two bones that are attached, should be attached, fused in the middle. So you might see it spelled with an AE at the end. That's maxillae, and that's because that's plural, because they're actually two. We're just going to say maxilla. This is the maxilla bone. Again, the lower portion of the orbit, so it's part of the orbit here, goes up and is part of or starts the bridge of the nose as well on the inside of the eye there. You can see like tear ducts would be right here. And then on the tan, we have the maxilla here. Okay, good. Then we have our palatine bone. Our palatine bone is on the underside. That's what the small model is not good for, that because it does not have a specific palatine bone. So I'm going to try to turn the skull upside down, and I'm actually going to remove, okay, our mandible, okay, so our jaw, the mandible. And when we're looking underneath here, hopefully you can see what we're looking at here, right? So now this is the occipital bone here, the temporal bones here and here, the sphenoid bone here, and then you can see maybe our ethmoid bone under here, the white part. And then when we look, we can see our maxilla, okay? And the maxilla forms part of our palate and the inside of our mouth, the front portion, but just posterior to that, because remember, this is where the face is, this is the back of the head. These are our palatine bones. Okay, so again, it's actually two bones that are fused together in the middle. So palatine bones or palatine bone, singular or plural. Okay, so it just kind of is a continuation of the top portion of our mouth, right? That palate there. You can see if we turn it to the side. So it's the top portion of our mouth. Okay, palatine bones. Next, we have our zygomatic bone. And the zygomatic bone is right here. It's our cheek bone. So you can see the cheekbone on either side. So there's one there and one there. They're pink on this. When we're looking, actually I should have mentioned the palatine bone on this. Let me go back for just a minute. So if I kind of move this jaw out of the way here, you can see the maxilla, and then they indicate the palatine bones here. And you can see the lines to indicate that these are the palatine bones. Okay. All right. So then if we go to our zygomatic bones are going to be right here. Okay. So the pink here and right here, they're the cheekbones, what we typically think of the cheekbones. So you can see they're part of the orbit here on the bottom right side, and they're part of the cheekbones. Okay. And what you need to know from the zygomatic bone is the zygomatic arch. Now, this is not labeled on the actual sheet, and that's because it's kind of a simplified term. But this is the zygomatic arch. And the reason it's not labeled is because it's actually technically part of the temporal bone here and the zygomatic bone. So this is actually the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, and this is the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. The two of those together make what you need to identify as the zygomatic arch, this part here. Okay. So right here, these two bones put together, this right here is the zygomatic arch. Okay, good. Next, we have the lacrimal bone. The color skulls are really great for this too, because the lacrimal bone is this orange one right here. I know that looking at images of the skull, it's hard to tell, like, what are we talking about? Because we have the ethmoid back here. Remember, we can see that, that's the white bone. And then we have this orange lacrimal bone. Okay, so again, part of the orbit. And so when we look at this skull, in here we can see the ethmoid, the side of the ethmoid bone here. And then we can see the lacrimal bone is just this tiny one here. Just like we can see, it's pretty small right here. And that's the lacrimal bone. The nasal bones, again, it's plural, but they're fused in the middle. So we have the nasal bones here. We have one on the right, one on the left, fused together in the middle. Nasal bones are the pink ones. And then we can see them here as well, the nasal bones on either side. Next, we have the vomer. So on this one, the vomer is labeled right here. It's this kind of pointy bone that comes out. Now this guy is missing the vomer because it doesn't like to stay in. It's actually attached to our sphenoid in the back, and then it comes out the front. So the vomer is this dark orange one that I'm kind of moving around. It actually tends to be fused in, particularly in our other models, to the bottom part of the ethmoid. It's hard to show a difference between the two of them. But you can see, if you can, hopefully you can see in there, you can see the white of the ethmoid bone superior, and you can see this dark orange, I'll kind of wiggle it, is the vomer at the bottom. Okay, so if we separated the bones, this is actually what the vomer looks like, and it sits like this in the skull. Now, if we look at this little model, so if we remember what this one is, this is the tiny one. Our frontal bone sits here, okay? So we can see right here, this is our ethmoid bone, and then down here would be the vomer. Now, this model, it's not separated, so I just wanted to show you what it would look like in a model that doesn't have them separated. You can also see on here the nasal bones. The nasal bones aren't separated. That's why this model isn't the best compared to these other models here that have every bone separated. You can see the nasal bones, the maxillae. You can see the zygomatic bones, but again, they're not separated, but zygomatic bones, zygomatic bones. And under here, again, the reason I don't necessarily like this model, or at least it's not the best, it's a good one, but is because you can't see the palatine bones. They didn't label them at all. So the palatine bones would be from here in this direction, posterior. And then this is the part of the maxilla. Okay. So next we have the mandible. So we know the mandible as the jaw, right? So any of these still have the mandible attached. So the mandible on this one, right? So this is our mandible, bottom part, our jaw. Okay, so you need to know the mandibular condyles. So this is where it articulates with the skull, right? So remember earlier on when we learned about our mandibular fossa, which was the indent here, it articulates, forms a joint with our mandibular condyle. Okay, so our mandibular condyle is on the mandible, okay, and it's this protrusion here. Of course, we have one on either side. Okay, so if we're just looking at the mandible, all right, it's this kind of bumpy one here, the bigger bumpy one that is going to attach to the temporal bone. The other one, the other part that you need to know is the coronoid process. So again, a process is also a protrusion, and that's this here, the coronoid process. So the, what do we call it, mandibular condyles are here, and the coronoid process is here. So the coronoid is smaller and more anterior, and our condyles are more posterior. Okay, good. All right, and so those are actually all of the bones. The other ones that are listed in the skull are the auditory ossicles. Now, we don't have any actual models of the auditory ossicles. They're very tiny. We'll need to look at images, so make sure that you look those up and know what they look like. The malleus, the incus, and the stapes are the three that you need to know. Then we have the hyoid bone. Again, we don't have a model of the hyoid bone, and those tend to get lost as models anyway because they are not attached to any other bones in the body. It is a horseshoe-shaped bone that is in the anterior portion of the neck. So it would be inferior to all of that we have here. But it is associated with the skull because it's a great connection and attachment point for lots of tendons, ligaments, and muscles. So that's important to know. All right, so hopefully that helped answer some questions. Hopefully you can see particularly those really difficult ones like the ethmoid and the sphenoid. Again, I want to just kind of show you that underside here. You need to know all of these bones and be able to label them in all of the different directions if they show up in those directions. So again, we can see things like the sphenoid and the ethmoid in directions that we might not be thinking of originally. So we see the sphenoid here and we can see the ethmoid in here, but we can see them this way, or one of them, right? We can see the sphenoid here, but also in here, right? We see the sphenoid in the back and we see the ethmoid here. Okay, and then remember the lacrimal is anterior to that. Hopefully that helped. Again, make sure that you can identify all of those different bones and bone structures, not only on our disarticulated skulls, which we'll hopefully have in our class, but make sure that you can identify them on this one. That's why I wanted to go through both so you could see them very clearly with the disarticulated skulls and then relay that to what you're seeing here in our articulated skulls. Make sure that you're aware of that in both of them and be able to label all of those structures and all of those bones in both types of skulls.